Many people raise orchids the wrong way. How can a novice raise orchids at home? Hello, I'm Kazuki. Welcome to click the plus sign on my avatar to follow me. Let's learn to grow flowers together. This orchid is one of the top 10 famous flowers in China. It has been welcomed by everyone since ancient times. Even if he doesn't need to bloom. Putting it at home has a unique ancient charm. How elegant is it? Many people love to raise. It's so beautiful. But after actually feeding, I found out. Orchids are not easy to raise. Because it is a famous watered plant. Very squeamish. It's prone to yellow leaves. The phenomenon of rotten leaves and black leaves. Or, no matter how you raise it, it won't bloom. In fact, the reasons for these phenomena. It's all because people don't understand the habits of orchids. Resulting from. What about in this course? Should it be called? Introduce the habits of orchids to you in detail. Help everyone raise orchids at home. Then come and learn with me. All right. What you see in front of you is a potted orchid plant. The first knowledge point we will talk about is orchids. Is he a thing that likes sheep or a thing that likes you? Here it is. When many beginners raise this plant for the first time. He doesn't care either. Take it home and throw it directly on the balcony to raise it. In fact, this is seriously wrong. Because orchids are not as strong. Sunshine flowers. If you put it on the balcony to expose it to the sun. Especially in the height of summer. Even if it's just for an hour. Orchids are prone to extensive sunburn. Yellow leaves will appear. So why is this happening? And that's because this plant is simply not tolerant of sun exposure. Is this going to follow? Go back to him. The native environment in which it grows. The environment in nature. Where does it grow? Orchids are born to grow in the mountains. Deep in the mountains. Generally, there are some dense forests above. Will block part of the sun from him. And what does the orchid see? It's more mottled sunlight. Instead of direct sunlight. So, he looked like this for hundreds of thousands of years. So you take it home and raise it. Throw it in the sun and it will die after being exposed to the sun. Did you notice? When you walk in the neighborhood of your home. Or you go outside. On the flower bed. What plants have you probably seen on the green belt? But did you notice? Never been on the green belt. We found an orchid. Have you found out? Why is that? Why don't you plant orchids in green belts? It is because of this plant that it is intolerant. Exposed to the sun outdoors. Are you impatient? You know, all over the city. He can't stand this smoke. Because he is more delicate. He is the mountain plant. Deep mountain plants, we can't alter his genes. Say I'm going to throw you into the sun. This is definitely not good for raising orchids, understand? So when we raise orchids in the family, you have to mimic the natural environment. Give him a so-called mottled sunlight. So what is mottled sunlight? Raised indoors in our family. The sunshine he likes is warmth and softness. And scattered light. What is this scattered light? After the sun comes in through the window. reflected on the wall. Then it slowly reflects off the wall onto its blades. And this light is the favorite light of orchids. Ah, this is scattered light. He doesn't have this white light spot. Sprinkle directly on his leaves. There is no such light when it is directly exposed to him. He is scattering. Where exactly is it placed in the home? Orchids are better raised. I'll teach everyone. Can you keep the orchids in your house? Lean against the window. But away from the window. A little bit next to the house is near the window. A little bit next to it. He is close to the window. There is no direct light that can reach orchids. Then this location is the most suitable location for raising orchids. Do you understand what I mean? So this position is purely scattered light. And the light is also very strong. More suitable for orchid palm. So many flower friends are wrong. What went wrong? The first one to throw it outdoors in the sun. That's definitely wrong. There is another kind of person. Keep orchids in, for example, the bathroom. He doesn't get any sunlight in the bathroom. Not even heat dissipation. There's no heat dissipation. That's not going to work either. Because he has no light. Orchids don't grow well either. Easy to yellow leaves. The leaves are sparse, a series of problems will occur. So there must be enough scattered light. Go find what I just said. It's near the window. But you can't get direct light. You can look for it. So let's move on to technique number 2. It is the root system characteristics and watering method of orchids. The root system of the orchid plant. It is completely different from the root system of ordinary plants. Its root is the root of the orchid. It's a very thick, white fleshy root system. Are its succulent root. White. Stout. Do you see it? See this place? What about this root? Unlike ordinary plants, it lies in the root of this flesh. Very high requirements for air permeability and water permeability. It can't be stuffed into the soil to raise it. Okay? So orchids in nature. Its long position is also breathable. Excellent location for water permeability. Rather than saying completely. Like we grow vegetables. Stuff all the soil with the roots, no. Orchids like this cannot grow in this soil. So when you go to keep the orchid, you should also pay attention to watering. Be sure to give it a good water permeability. You can't store water in a flower pot. Can't let it go. Then our family raises orchids specifically. How to water it? Let's talk about it here. Before we water it, don't wrote that you water it once a few days. Many beginners like to make this mistake. What? Once every 2 days? Once every 3 days? Once every 5 days, etc. Don't call it that. Because spring and summer, his soil may be dry in 2 or 3 days. But in winter when the temperature is very low, maybe half a month, his soil is probably damp. If you are in the cold, you still keep watering for 3 days. Then it will rot. So let's not take a few days. Instead, observe the state of the orchid soil. To judge whether to water it or not. Sounds complicated. And it's very simple. Before we water it, you can look at the soil of orchids with your eyes. Then pour your hand and touch the soil of the orchid. Touch it. If you feel that the soil of the orchid is a little moist, Aha. Then you don't need to water it at this time. Or you can lift the orchid pot. Found that the flower pot is heavy. No need to water it. That means there's already a lot of water in it. Understand? He doesn't need to be watered if he's wet. Don't water it for a long time. Even if you feel wet in winter. The integrated flower pot is heavy. Then I am a month. If you touch it again, it's still the same. Don't water it for a month. Hey, don't worry, you won't die. When will the medicine be poured? Very simple. When you touch it with your hand, the soil feels a little dry. Don't wait for it to dry. When I lift the flower pot, I feel that the flower pot is starting to become lighter. Then we can give it to him immediately. Pour water on it. Understand? Then you use this watering method. You will never run out of water. It will never accumulate water and rot. Because we touch the soil every time we water it. All guarantee it. It was poured under the condition of relatively lack of water. So this watering method is fine. Over the years. This is perfect for orchids. Okay. Let's talk about the soil requirements for orchids. And its basin changing skills. Then our family raises orchids. What kind of soil do you use to grow orchids? Can you dig some soil on the roadside to grow orchids? And I tell you, absolutely not. Because of the orchid, its fleshy heel is very scary. Too sticky, airtight soil. And the mud on the side of the road. Pastoral soils tend to be young, huge, and too breathable. That doesn't work. Understand? It's hard to raise orchids well. What do you use to paint orchids? Orchids prefer sparse, loose and breathable granular soil. Generally, it is not called soil. Our flower friends who raise orchids are called plant materials. Plant material. It's called orchid material. So how do we choose the plant material for orchids? Don't use ordinary mud soil seeds. I'll teach you. First of all, novice flower friend, when you buy directly online, you go search. It's called orchid special soil. Or orchid specific soil. You go buy this soil and grow orchids. This soil. Is it average? It is a combination of various materials. For example, there is tree bark. Is there a bigger stone? Ah, there's some big perlite. Oh, wait a minute. Including volcanic rocks and so on. It comes in a variety of materials. It's a very breathable material. Combine. This material is characterized by breathability and water permeability. And it also takes into account a certain water retention. This kind of picture, remember these 3 points I said. Breathable and water permeable, strong and certain water retention. This is the perfect soil for orchids. It's basically very grainy soil. It's granular soil. It looks like the regular one. This so-called soil you see. Completely different. That's absolutely right. Ah, I'm just talking about this. You may not understand it very well. I'll bring one here for you to see. Do you see it? Can you see what I have written here? See no orchids. Special soil? Soil for orchids. See, orchid special planting materials? What does it look like? Let me show you. Grab a handful for you to see. See what I'm holding? Did you see it? Is not us at all. Beginners still have the soil of understanding. Is it plant material? Is it all kinds of bark? Volcanic rock? Perlite? All kinds of materials. And some big sawdust, combined. All kinds of materials are available. After he matched it. Form this. The feeling of looking like stone. This is suitable for growing orchids. Why is that? Because as soon as the water is poured in, it will come out directly. No water will accumulate. And what orchids are most afraid of is stagnant water and wave roots. And the soil is completely breathable. Because it's so grainy. As soon as the wind blows in, it breathes. So the root system is always in a breathable and watery environment. And it adds bark. It also has a certain water retention. So you understand the 3 words I just said. 3 words no. Breathable and water permeable and strong, certain water retention. This is the most suitable soil for orchids. So they grew orchids. To pick this soil I'm holding in my hand. I showed it to you, don't you know? You know that, right? Go pick this soil in my hand and plant orchids. It's called orchid special planting material. Remember to ask his soil carefully. Again, change the basin. Do you want to change the orchids in our family? What about the basin? The answer is yes. But don't change the basin indiscriminately. First of all, we raised orchids in the family. You can keep it for at least a year before considering changing the basin. Don't change it for him at every turn. Because of his root system. The growth rate itself is not fast. It must be at least 1 year or more. Even a year or 2 is no problem, etc. His entire root system. Make sure he's full of pots. Change the basin again, otherwise there is no need to change the basin for the time being. Do you understand? When changing the basin, you also need to pay attention to 2 points first. When changing the basin, you should also replace him with this granular soil. Use the same soil. You don't want to change his soil. You'll have a hard time adjusting. The second is when you change the basin. Don't pick a flower pot that is too big. What about orchid pots? They are usually high-footed pots. Just one size larger than the original flower pot. Just a little bigger. The flower pot is too big. Soil permeability will be affected. Water permeability will be affected. It rots easily. So don't be greedy for the flower pot. A little bigger than the original is enough. Okay. Now let's explain the transparency of orchids. Gas requirement. That orchid. He was very, very breathable. Tall. He doesn't like to overdo it. In a closed, airtight environment. Excessive airtight and unventilated. He is prone to pests and diseases. Yellow leaves and black leaves are easy to appear. I feel this very deeply. Because I used to. Because of my previous scientific work on orchids. We managed 30,000 acres of orchids. So many orchids he raised. For example, he keeps it in a greenhouse. Is fully ventilated in there. When planted in an unventilated environment. We're even going to put water curtains on both ends of him. Then install the exhaust fan. Large extractor fan, large water curtain to ventilate him. Water wow, this wind is boasting. Pass through, pass through. It has to be. Because if you don't ventilate, you're doomed. This orchid is definitely not good. Okay? So we keep orchids in the family. You have to make sure he in a fully ventilated environment. Don't let him keep too many secrets. So if everyone is in a completely closed state, When raising orchids, you must pay attention to opening windows for ventilation. Is that a guarantee for his health? I hope you will pay attention to this. Okay, let's talk about orchids. Fertilization tips. And here it is, and I'm going to tell you. What if you are a novice in raising orchids? I suggest you not to fertilize the orchids. Orchids are plants. It's very different from other plants. Is that it is very sensitive to fertilizers. If you fertilize casually, fertilizer concentration is slightly higher. It will burn seedlings at once. Once the seedlings are burned, the leaves will turn yellow. And this kind of damage is irreversible damage. So when we raise orchids, be careful with fertilizer. Especially novice flower friends. You might as well not fertilize. Ordinary fertilizer? It's just ordinary chemical fertilizers, don't use them all. Oh, why? Because it is easy to burn seedlings if you use it. So what if it grows without nutrients? I'll teach you 2 tricks. One trick is that you don't use ordinary fertilizer. What fat can you use? I teach everyone that you can use Lanling King. King Lanling can be used. What is the King of Lanling? This is no ordinary fertilizer. It's bacterial fertilizer. He is adding to the orchid this beneficial bacteria. And this mushroom can root orchids. Achieve mycorrhizal symbiosis. To promote the root debris growth of orchids. We all know that raising orchids first raises roots. He grows well. Orchids grow naturally well. So we raise orchids. You can just use Lanling King. What about King Lanling? It is also a kind of liquid fertilizer. Do you use it once a month? Just wet a small amount with a little thin fat poultry. This bacteria can be used. What kind of ordinary fertilizer? Don't use any compound fertilizers. Do you understand? Another is that you are worried that he is not nutritious enough. No, aren't you going to change the basin for him? Every time you change the pot of the orchid. In fact, it just added nutrition to him. So many flower friends. For example, I change the basin once a year. Change the basin every 2 years. Then when you change the basin in the past year or 2, just added soil nutrients to him once. Because you have new mixed soil. New pots are enough. So you can use no ordinary fertilizer. It doesn't matter. Do you understand? So novice flower friends, I'm still emphasizing. Don't use fertilizer indiscriminately. At most, it is enough to use the Lanling King. All right. Now let me tell you about the wintering skills of orchids. How should families raise orchids for the winter? Orchids are plants. In fact, it is born with a certain degree of cold resistance. Its cold resistance is actually quite good. Most varieties of orchids are more resistant to cold. In the warmer southern regions, he can spend the winter outdoors. Is there any problem? It's just that I'm more afraid of a long-term low temperature. For example, are you in the north? Or some of the colder southern regions? The temperature should be lower than 0 degrees for a long time. In an environment below 0 degrees, orchids are easily frostbitten. But around 0 degrees, he's just frostbitten, usually he can't freeze to death. It will only be said that it has been below 0 degrees for a long time. Like the bitter cold of minus tens of degrees in the north, he will freeze to death. So you should pay attention when you raise it in the south. If your local area is warmer, you don't care about the outdoors. No problem. What if you're local? It is relatively cold and will be below 0 for a long time. What about this environment? You have been thrown outside for a long time, although he does not die. However, there is a good chance of extensive frostbite. It's just that some leaves will freeze yellow. Then if you are more concerned, I suggest everyone. The change temperature is starting to drop below 10 degrees. At this time, you can be vigilant and move it to the room. Came inside. Winter. What if you grow orchids outdoors? It would be safer to let him spend the winter indoors. There will be no extensive frostbite and yellow cracking. Northern flower friends, don't think about it. Because of the low temperature of tens of degrees outdoors, orchids are unbearable. Then once the temperature drops below 10 degrees, we have to move it indoors for the winter. In addition to keeping it warm during the winter, also pay attention to humidity. Because orchids are a very washed plants. As I said just now, he writes very much about ventilation. Then I said him, we need to install water curtains in our greenhouse. What is the water curtain for? It's for humidification, you know? So he likes it very much. High humidity and high ventilation conditions. Then in the winter, the humidity is often relatively low, especially when the heating is turned on at the house of northern flower friends. Humidity may be lower than 50%. If the orchid is in such a dry environment, it's prone to yellow leaves. Dry tip crimping phenomenon. So in this environment, we must humidify it when we raise orchids. Or are you relying on a humidifier? But it doesn't matter if there is no humidifier. You need to prepare a water bottle. What about in winter? Every morning when you wake up and every evening in the evening. As the sun sets, spray his leaves like this. Spray at least twice a day. In principle, more is better. This can greatly enhance him. The air humidity around the leaves. Prevent the occurrence of yellow leaves and dry tips. So this winter, humidification is also very important. Okay, let's explain it below. Orchid pruning skills. What about the orchid? There is no hard trimming requirement. But there are two techniques you should pay attention to. So here's the first trick. If there are dry tips on the leaves of an orchid, the tip is withered and yellow. Or are there some dark spots? Massive wilting. Are this phenomenon? The leaves. It's called diseased leaves. We must timely remove the diseased leaves. Partially trimmed off. For example, his front end is dry and black. Let's cut off the front end for him. And I'll give you an example below. What if it turns yellow at night? We directly use diagonal shears. Cut it off. Keep it night also appears a tip, so it doesn't affect its entire growth. And watch. Then trim it off in time. Why are we cutting these? What about the withered and blackened leaves? Because this part of it carries the germs. There is a risk of further infection, or it can spread to other healthy leaves. So pay attention to this pruning. The second pruning is if the orchid blooms after the flowers wither. Be sure to cut off its entire pedicel in time. Don't keep it above, because the whole pedicel will consume nutrients very much. It's a hidden flower. Consumes a lot of nutrients. It is not conducive to the later growth of the entire orchid. So once the flowers wither, be sure to remember to trim in time. Okay. And then finally, the orchid technique. Orchid, what about the seeds it bears after it blooms? We don't normally push people to reproduce with seeds. It's very difficult to reproduce, because orchid seeds are planted in potassium. It could have tens of thousands of seeds, but his seeds are really small. Like dust. This little seed. The germination rate in nature is not high. Germination at home has a curvature of 0. Although he has tens of thousands of. But you plant seeds that are almost impossible to germinate. So the probability of germination rate is too low. Therefore, it is not recommended to use the method of sowing. So how do we breed orchids in our house? They usually do it by rafting. What is ramification? It's actually very simple. We don't do it every year or once or twice. Will you change the basin next year? When you change the basin, you cut an orchid in half through the middle. Divide the root system in half. Half on the left and half on the right, and then divide it into 2 pots of seeds. In this case, 1 pot becomes 2 pots. This is called bead propagation. We use this method in our own reproduction. So wait until it grows up. You can keep dividing everyone like this. Share it with everyone. You can divide more and more. This is how family orchids reproduce. Okay, this issue is about LAN. And that's the end of the flower course. Welcome to click to follow, so you can watch more of me. Flower growing course is taught. See you in the next session.